Greetings, sailors, and welcome to another surprise Tier 5 premium release. Another surprise Tier 5 premium review from me. I don't think any of us really knew this was going to be released. It came out for German Unification Day. And, well, for one thing, that's a little bit odd because it's an Austro-Hungarian dreadnought, but okay. But, you know, it's nice to have another fairly historical ship in the game. I think it's reasonably famous. It was one of the only class of dreadnoughts that the Austro-Hungarian Empire produced before its dissolution at the end of, well, in the aftermath of World War One. So, you know, on that level, definitely an interesting collector's piece. On another level, on the level of being an actual ship to play, oh boy. Well, okay, where do we start? Let's go with the good points, because it does have some good points. But they are unfortunately not enough to make up for the severity of the bad points, but, you know, I'm not going to pretend it's totally awful. Now, the main nice thing about this ship is the guns. They're 305mm, 12-inch guns. You have a dozen of them, so you've got the biggest broadside at the tier. It's not the biggest caliber at the tier, but there are other 12-inch gunned battleships at this tier, so that's fine. It's not completely out of place. You don't have the punch of 14-inch guns, but in terms of accuracy and consistency, yeah, it's pretty good, actually. I have no complaints as far as the firepower of this ship goes. It's also stealthy for a Tier 5 battleship. It's, I think, just under 11 kilometers surface detection with the captain skill that temporarily escapes me because my brain is wonderful like that. It also has a really good turn radius. It's, I think, 560 meters. At least that's what's listed. Little White Mouse of the twirling ships fame. Well, I don't know if you follow her work on any of the places she posts it, but she does tests of ships to well, one of the things she's been doing recently is testing ships to be sure that the listed port values actually match up with the real in-game performance, and there are some real oddities out there, so I don't know if Viribus Unitis will be one of them, but it's listed as, I think, 560 meters. It's a very tight turning ship. It's also a very slow ship, so it kind of makes sense, but even compared to, say, the New York or the Texas, this, in battleship terms, turns on a dime. And that's it, really. You know, the model also looks quite nice. It's got a very properly dreadnought feel to it. It hasn't been implemented in a fantasy refit version as, say, the Eitel Friedrich was at Tier 6, or the Bayern of the regular tech tree ships. This is a proper looking dreadnought. And it's not the only dreadnought at Tier 5 by any means. You know, I've mentioned the New York already, and there are others. But those are all, you know, in some cases later ships or refitted ships. And there are two major weaknesses, I think, that really come out of it being in that kind of base state, as it were. The first is, and the biggest by a fairly chunky margin, is the hit points. You might notice 35,700 is all you get. That's Tier 3 battleship levels of hit points. I'm just going to let that sink in. It would be bad at Tier 4 even, but no. At Tier 5 it's fairly horrendous. Everyone else has around 10 to 15,000 more hit points than you do, and it makes a real difference. The other particular stinker of a stat is the AA, which is also I don't know if it's quite tier 3 levels. I haven't actually checked the tier 3 AA, but it's probably about that. It's got 4 70mm AA guns, and you've got a range of, I think, 3 kilometers on those guns, and that's it. You are basically easy prey for carriers in exactly the same way as the Arkansas Beta. So you might be thinking, you know, well, it's got these 2 huge liabilities, especially as it can now see tier 7s. You would think it would have some equally amazing something going for it, but it really doesn't. The gunnery, as I've said, is good, but it would have to be absolutely gosh darn downright amazing to make up for quite how vulnerable you are with only 35,000 hit points. It's not that good, and I wouldn't want it to be that good at this tier. Now, there are some other things to bring in. I mean, initially we got to test this way earlier in the year as a tier 4. It was initially intended to be a tier 4, but the armor would have been really pretty good for tier 4. Not, I think, the best, but still quite good. And it holds up okay at tier 5, but it's nothing special. The bigger issue would have been the barrel count. A dozen 12-inch guns at tier 4 is a meaty broadside, and it's still a meaty broadside at tier 5, but less so, given that you're now facing better armoured ships with bigger guns. So the guns absolutely don't make up for anything else. But there were changes that were announced after we got our hands on it initially that then seem to have never been implemented. Now I'm going to say we never got to test it as a tier 5. Everyone's experience from playing it was as the tier 4, and I think the general consensus was from the CCs that played it that it felt too good as a tier 4. And I think it could be made to work as a tier 5, but yeah, not quite like this. So the changes they announced that weren't implemented were changing it from 1.8 Sigma to 1.65, and that apparently never happened, and also altering the heal so that it healed a bit less regular full pen damage, but a bit more citadel damage. So not really a straight buff to the heal, but getting more of your citadel damage back, being able to heal more heavy damage, that would have been a pretty biggie compared to how it is at the moment with an utterly standard heal and an utterly standard damage control party. And you've only got 35,000 hit points. So this stuff matters quite a lot. So yeah, I mean, just looking at this ship and having played this ship and comparing it to the stats of the other tier 5 battleships, I think this is a very strong contender for the title of the worst battleship at tier 5 at the moment. And absolutely the biggest factor is the hit points, but some people might also consider the AA to be equally as significant, or rather the lack of AA. So, although a lot of people have been calling for this to be maybe made a tier 4 again, I personally think it could be made to work as a tier 5, but you would have to slap some kind of super heal on it, or maybe a very quick cooldown on the heal. Certainly a faster cooldown on the damage control party would also be welcome, because I found myself using it a lot more for single fires in this ship, just because you can't afford to let a fire burn. You can't afford to lose the hit points when you have so few of them compared to your peers. So it then makes it that much more vulnerable to having multiple fires set later on. So yeah, the survivability of this ship is just overall trash level. It's so bad in that regard, and this is the main reason why, even though Wargaming has managed to make a tier 5 battleship with guns that actually feel pretty good to use overall, it's still easily in the running for worst battleship at tier 5. I think the only one in my personal estimation that comes close is the tier 5 French battleship. And that's actually got bigger guns and a rather better range. But also, not great armour, and its guns are a bit on the frustrating side to use. So I picked this game out, by the way, because yeah, it's a pretty decent damage game, although mostly from farming that Orion. I think that was almost half my damage done was from that one ship, but as you can see, our team got fairly well squashed. A big part of it was that Okhotnik, that enemy Okhotnik, who's about to get their 7th kill very shortly. This was at least one of the games where I didn't get bitch slapped around the place by double tier 4 carriers. I've had more than a few of those, and if this was moved down to tier 4, that would absolutely not change. What I would like from this ship is, you know, aside from having mentioned the survivability issues, a bit more range. Because at the moment, that's also an issue. It's slow, and it has the joint worst range at tier 5. And that's especially a big issue when you can get into tier 7 games. The only other one that's that bad is the Piotr Veliki, which has much better armour, 14-inch guns, and I think just over 50,000 hit points? It's not far off 15k hit points better. It's like 14 point something thousand hit points. It's a lot more survivable for being able to get in close. And it also has better AA. I mean, I don't think it's particularly amazing AA, but everything has better AA than the Viribus at tier 5, except some of the destroyers, basically. The AA is that bad. So I absolutely can't recommend this in its current state. This is an absolute one to avoid. The Yahagi that just came out, well, that at least had, I think, enough positives going for it to make it a challenging but potentially rewarding ship. You know, it's definitely a very high skill ceiling ship. This, oof, well, you know, you'll have some decent games, but as a ship to actually influence the outcome of battles in, as a ship to not just get slapped around in and die early in over and over again, yeah, it's not so good. It really isn't. Heck, the one thing I learned looking at the various stat sites, I've played, I think, maybe something like 12 to 15 games in this so far, overall, since it was released, including a couple on stream yesterday. I've been trying to find out my survivability rating in this ship compared to my other ships, and I can only find a global survivability rating on some of the stats sites, unfortunately. But if I had to, you know, make a guess, which I am making a guess right here, it's going to be considerably worse than my other tier 5 battleships. It's not a fun ship to play. You just feel like a big sacrificial punching bag 90% of the time. So yeah, give this one a miss. I sincerely hope it will get some kind of buffs at some point. It could be potentially a somewhat interesting ship to play at tier 5. It could be lifted up to Yahagi territory, where it has some serious liabilities, but also some real benefits to go along with that, some absolutely strong characteristics to counterbalance it, and at the moment it doesn't. The guns by themselves do not lift this up far enough to even get to that interesting but flawed category. So that's it for the Viribus Unitis, a rather poor showing for the first and only Austro-Hungarian dreadnought that we'll see in the game. On the plus side, I did get to go and listen to the anthem, the national anthem of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was quite catchy, although pretty much basically also the same as the German national anthem somehow. I don't know quite how they're interrelated, but yeah, they sound very similar. Still quite catchy though. Anyway, so that's my take on the Viribus Unitis. Big thumbs down. Oh dear. Hopefully you found this video interesting, and if you did, you can do all the usual things down underneath it. And of course, as always, stay tuned for more.